My action research was done on the effects of literature circles on comprehension and motivation. When I was first trying to decide what I wanted to do for my action research, I wanted to focus on my students who were reading above grade level because about half of my class was reading above grade level. So my inquiry question was, how does the implementation of literature circles affect the motivation and comprehension of academic texts in above grade level readers? I noticed throughout the year that my students who were high readers loved to read for pleasure. It was hard to get their attention when they weren't reading a book. And I would often see them having conversations with their friends about what they were reading and getting them to read the books. However, during guided reading, I noticed that they would often give very short or one word answers. And even if I gave them discussion topics, our discussions would be very short, and most of the students would just stop and not really add their input in our discussion. And I also wanted the other part of my action research was focusing on the comprehension because I noticed that their comprehension was on such a surface level, and they didn't really make a lot of connections to themselves. They didn't really extend their thinking to think about the text on a deeper level and really apply those higher order thinking skills. So this is the breakdown of my school. We are a primary school that only goes up to second grade. We have about 647 students, and we have various programs. We have a magnet program at our school. So we have students throughout the county who apply to the magnet program, and when they're accepted, they are part of a cohort, and it kind of helps place them into the program for later on when it starts in third and fourth grade. This is a breakdown of my students. I have 19 students, and it's just the demographics, and it was difficult to find information on which one of my students were part of the magnet program, but this is everything else about my class. So for my data collection, originally I started with 3 data points and extended it to 5 so that I could get more quantitative and qualitative data. I conducted interviews before and after the implementation of literature circles. I took field notes at least once a week on things that I observed my students doing, their body language, which students were present. I collected student work at least once a week, and the 2 that I added was a literature circles checklist, and it kind of helped map out the higher order thinking skills and the frequency of the different responses that they gave. And I also used formative assessments required by the county. These assessments are written responses that we're required to do quarterly, either once or twice during the quarter, and it assessed them on whether or not they were able to answer the question, give support, and also use of language with their grammar, punctuation, and whether or not it made sense. So if you look at Appendix C, I have the interview questions that I asked before and after conducting the literature circles. And this was the example of the literature circles checklist. And it broke it down to higher level responses, literal responses, and discussion behaviors. So I was able to use this to keep track of the frequencies and the different responses that they gave that went along with their roles. For my data analysis strategies, I was able to use a lot of the text in order to help me with the analysis of all of my data. I began with organizing types of data to identify codes, themes, and patterns. So I reread over the field notes multiple times to find themes and similarities. Going along with that, I also made memos to myself on things that stuck out to me, just things that I thought were interesting so that I could come back to it later and see if there was a theme. I was also able to carefully monitor the ratio of listening to talking while writing the field notes, which was difficult because I was so used to leading the guided reading sessions. However, with literature circles, I needed to give the students a chance to have a discussion on the book, so I made sure that I did more listening rather than talking. And I was able to gather observations and data that was relevant to the interpretations of the classroom events that are on the topic of inquiry. So I noticed in my field notes, in the beginning, I wrote down everything that was going on, and realized that I needed to scale back because it wasn't relevant to my action research, and I needed to focus on just that rather than everything that was going on because it was too difficult to write down everything and it didn't help me with answering my inquiry. So for my results, I broke it down into my different themes. The first was the different reactions to different literature circle roles. So overall, I was able to find that students enjoyed the literature circle roles that allowed more freedom. The two that I noticed the students didn't really enjoy were the Word Wizard and Literary Illuminator. For Word Wizard, they had to choose a word that was either new or interesting to them and respond by saying why they chose it, and how it could help the reader and the group understand the text better. So when I noticed looking at their responses, their answers were usually one word, it had no elaboration, and usually there were statements like, I didn't know what it meant. And when I asked them to discuss further on why they chose a word, they just kept saying that they didn't know what the word meant. The second was the Literary Illuminator, and they were supposed to choose a passage, either a short sentence or a few sentences that they thought was really interesting. Maybe it was confusing. But again, they responded with very short answers and very vague statements like it was really interesting, it was confusing, or cool. And when asked to elaborate in the groups, they just said what they wrote and didn't want to elaborate on it at all. However, the two that I found that brought out a lot of discussion within the group and looking at their responses that they really elaborated on was a discussion director and connection maker. The discussion director needed to come up with several questions that the group would discuss, and going back and looking at their responses, I noticed that they came up with a lot of why questions. So they weren't just questions that could be answered using one word or looking in the text, but they really were curious about how the other students thought about the book or their opinion, and wanted to hear their input. And it led to really rich discussions about the character choices and just their thoughts and opinions about what was going on in the book. The second that brought out a lot of discussion was the connection maker, and the students were responsible for making either a text to world, text to text, or text to self connection. And going back and looking at their responses in the checklist, I saw that they made at least one connection. Often they made two or even three connections, and they're really excited to share what their connection was, especially when it was a text to self or text to world. And that brought out discussions on the connections that other students made, and they were curious to hear the different connections that the other students could make to the same event or passage from the book. So this is a chart that I made using for my quantitative data, and it was the frequencies and the types of responses. So looking at it at first glance, it looks like for the text to text, text to world, and text to self connections that there weren't as many connections made. However, these students had this job about 2 or 3 times, so it was able to match the data that I had said before on how the students made at least one connection, often 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 different types of connections every time it was their role. So there's a greater frequency. It was separated into these different subtexts or sub categories. However, it counted as one role. And I was able to separate all of the different responses. And if you look at the question section, it says asking why questions. A lot of the students were able to ask the group why questions because they were supposed to choose either 2 or 3 questions that they wanted to discuss. And although it looks like the students had a higher frequency in discussing unknown words and ideas and interesting words, which connected back to the word wizard and literary illuminator, they had these jobs more frequently during our literature circles sessions. This was a result. This was part of my second theme that I saw within my results, and it was a relationship influence on student participation. So if you see, it was breaking up by my 3 students in these 3 different colors, and the frequency and the number of questions that they asked, commenting on another student's response, and answering another person's question. And this was for the 8-week duration. So what I noticed in my field notes was that Christine participated an average of 3 times when her friend was present. And when Christine's friend was absent, she participated an average of 1 time. So I had students come from a different class and would join us for our guided reading sessions. And one of the students that came into my class was Christine's friend. So something that I noticed in my field notes was that she participated more, and it had an influence on the number of times and the types of responses that she would make. My other student, Jane, participated the most, and she had several friends in her reading group. So I noticed also in my field notes that her questions and comments were usually directed toward her friends or in response to her friends. So the conclusion that I made was that relationships among students may have an effect on their willingness to be vulnerable when discussing the book. And it just made me think about how the students are more willing to talk when they know that it's a safe space. So if within the group, relationships are able to be built, I think the students will have more of a willingness to discuss their opinions without the fear of wondering what the other students are going to think. Another theme that came out from my results was the student response to book choice. So one of the questions that I asked in my interview was, what don't you like about the books in guided reading? And before the implementation of literature circles, my students responded by saying that the books aren't that interesting to me. I don't like the topics of the books, and the books are sometimes boring, which was a shock for me because these students that were my focus students always seemed engaged. They seemed really positive about guided reading, so I didn't know that they had these opinions on the different books that we were reading because they didn't really vocalize how they were feeling. However, after my literature circle, after the implementation of literature circles, the students said that they really liked the books they were reading because they learned a lot about spotted owls, Nothing because I got to choose the books with the rest of the group, and I didn't want